All right, we're going to do a kickoff call for the Monitor Health team, and we're going to walk through our planning board to look at what's coming up for 12.4. So I'm going to share my screen. And as a reminder, let's just make this like a regular meeting. This should be interactive. You guys should ask questions. This does not have to be a scripted recording. So we're looking at the planning board. And the first three issues you guys see here are sparse with information because they are placeholders. We have done some awesome work on digging into how to embed Grafana metrics in issues. And out of that came 3 different spikes. So I'll scroll to those spikes in the 12.3 column so we can look at them up top here. We are out of Tristan and Olena's time zones. So Clement, would you mind speaking to these? Or Laura, somebody?
Sure, I can speak to it. You want me to explain kind of the spikes?
Yeah, and I can open those as we go. So determine and implement off between Grafana and GitLab.
Cool, yeah. So the big part that is kind of bleeding over to 12.4 is how we're going to handle Grafana and embedding Grafana charts in GitLab issues. So we want to set up a way to authenticate between Grafana and GitLab so that we can also pull in private charts. So for 12.3, we've made it, we've documented a way to embed your Grafana charts using what Grafana already offers using their specific URL that they generate, but that only works for publicly visible charts, which is not usually for all use cases. So authenticating will allow us to do that as well as do a richer integration.
Awesome. Anybody have any questions on that? Cool. So I have created a placeholder issue for results from that spike. Either way, we're going to fill this issue out with findings from the spike. If we determine this to be a several-month effort, we may deprioritize this. We did determine a workaround for how people can share Grafana charts, both static and then with live data that updates using image snapshots and embedding those in issues using an image tag. And that is sufficient for our use case. So scope and level of effort, or scope will be determined based on level of effort for all of these that we're going to talk through. All right, so the next one was, maybe let's talk about this one first. Use Grafana JSON to render a GitLab chart in an issue.
Yeah, so I can talk about this one. So after we handle authentication, we've discussed extensively how we can better embed Grafana in issues so that they're treated as first-class citizens. And it seems like one of the more promising strategies is to authenticate with Grafana's API and pull the JSON data from their charts and then rendering it using our own GitLab charts into issues. And so this spike will investigate how feasible that is and whether that's how we should go forward. Some of the caveats are Grafana has a lot of panel types, which could make this a little bit more challenging depending on which chart types we want to support, because we don't support as many as they do. But that is something that we'll hopefully figure out in the spike.
Perfect. Any questions, guys? That was pretty clear. We've got the placeholder one here. And then, all right, our last one is essentially a generic method of what Clement just described.
Yeah, so this came out of the discussion with the Grafana integration. We talked about, hey, if we are considering setting it up so that Grafana can authenticate and passes some JSON data, and we kind of take that information and render it our own charts, why don't we consider having some kind of generic method where people can pass as data sources so that we can load in our own charts. So similar to our generic alerts, or I don't know the specific name, but the generic alert work that we're doing in this release, this is kind of similar concept because there are a lot of other vendors besides Grafana that customers use that it would be really nice to have a easy way to integrate with all of them. So this spike will investigate that.
And does our conversion to using eCharts help with this at all? Does it enable it or make it easier?
I don't really quite understand your question. Could you rephrase it real quick?
Would we be able to do this without eCharts? So if we were just using the charting solution that was homegrown that we were using before, we could still do this? I'm just curious if eCharts plays into this at all, or if it doesn't really matter.
The charts that we have now that were wrapped on top of eCharts has way surpassed what we had before. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Awesome. So based on the outcome of those spikes, we'll be scheduling all of that work or some of that work depending on level of effort and how we scope those. Fantastic. Right, moving right along. Up next is part of our modifications to the existing Slack integration. We are adding additional slash commands to the suite of slash commands that we already offer to people who integrate between GitLab and Slack. This specific one will be the ability to add a comment to a specific issue within GitLab from Slack. So the problem that this solves is people want to work where they are able to communicate with others in a convenient way. Slack has stood out as a leader in this space, integrating with all tools of any kind and enabling people to take actions upon events from those tools. So this is particularly prevalent within incident management. Our chat ops feature is based on Slack. And so we've decided to extend this, adding a few more slash commands and a few more aspects to that Slack integration as we build out incident management. So this particular one is the ability to add comments to issues. This is really helpful if you're communicating with your team in Slack, but you're using the issue in GitLab as the place of historical reference, where you are storing status updates, where you're communicating progress to your stakeholders. It is also the artifact that lives on beyond the firefight, so you can use it for post-incident reviews. Slack is a temporary solution, and we do not use it for storage of historical events. So the ability to add a comment there from Slack makes it a lot easier for people in the midst of the firefight to catalog things that are happening and keep track of events that are important for them to review later. I believe we're using the existing Slack command model. Amelia, did I miss anything in that description?
No, I think that's everything.
Awesome. Did anybody have any questions on this? Perfect. Moving on. Cool. Okay. So next, we're coming up on 2 topics that are going to make our new alert endpoint much more viable for a broader spectrum of users. We're going to approach this from 2 different angles. The first angle is making it viable for people who use Prometheus for monitoring, and then looking at it from the generic perspective, so addressing other monitoring tools. So the first one on the list is closing issues based on recovery alerts. So the summary of this is monitoring tools often emit recovery alerts when the problem is solved, and the problem can either fix itself or someone can fix the problem and said system that's being monitored returns to a healthy state. The tool recognizes that and emits an alert. When a recovery alert is emitted, we should be closing GitLab issues automatically to remove manual work required to do that, so people don't have to remember, so you don't have a bunch of open issues in GitLab that don't need to be paid attention to. So to the endpoint today that receives alerts from Prometheus, we want to be recognizing those that are recovery, identifying them with an open GitLab issue, and closing that issue automatically. Other aspects of this experience could be the addition of a system message to the body, to the discussion on the issue that says closed by system, or something of that nature. I post this as a spike for 12.3 if we have capacity to work on that. And this is something that we want to be looking at in 12.4. Do we have any questions on this? Concerns, thoughts? I'll pause for a second.
I mean, this isn't really a question, but it is something that we have been discussing already on this issue and another issue, which is just that we, at the moment, I think, don't have a way to uniquely identify what issues are associated with what alert. And so that's called out there, even in the proposal. And that is some of the investigation that's ongoing right now, what the best way to do that is.
Awesome. So the other one that is very related to this is the deduplication of alerts. So we'll look at the Prometheus one first. So basic notion is a tool is emitting alerts. They often do it on a set cadence. If the same alert is received by GitLab, we do not want to create another issue if there is already an open issue for that alert. So along the same vein as receiving recovery alerts and figuring out what issue those belong to, we need to be doing the same with critical alerts. And so figuring out how we store and then associate those is part of the spike. Did I miss anything in that? I think that's it. Again, commitment to these two features will depend upon the results of the spike and level of effort. We may need to split this out over 2 milestones, depending on the amount of pre-work we need to do to be storing, searching for these alerts, and then how we're uniquely identifying them. Okay. We have 2 other issues along the same vein. So closing an issue on a recovery alert for alerts coming in from other tools. So any alert coming into the alert endpoint. And then the deduplication of generic alerts. For these particular features, I think we're going to need to do it by specific monitoring tool. Let's look at this one first. So closing an issue from a recovery alert for the generic alert endpoint. Some monitoring tools just don't emit recovery alerts. We'll need to be determining what kind of alert it is, so what tool it came from, and then the unique identifier for that type of alert. I've listed a handful of common tools in the proposal. A lot of these came from a UX research issue that we did about 1.5 years ago, where they surveyed almost 300 customers of ours. So that is where this list came from. And then I'd also love for us to look at Splunk and Nagios, as those are commonly used in this space as well. Do we have any questions on this guy? This is also something we need to spike on and then determine level of effort and scope.
Can we prefix the issue with spike?
So here's a question. This is the work, and I've scheduled it for 12:4. Do we want to create a spike for it and put it in 12:3?
I think, I mean, what we used to do is there would just be some investigation into that issue and the technical sort of scope of it before the next milestone comes, which is different than doing a spike, which I would say a spike is typically more involved, and you expect somebody to spend like a concerted amount of time and probably build something to test it out. So for this one, I think that what we can start with is just some technical investigation. And if the person doing that decides that we really need to try something out or spend a lot more time on it, then we can create a spike. That'd be my recommendation.
Cool, we can do with that.
Awesome. All right. And the last few. So got an issue in here for documentation for incident management. Due to the nature of how we release product at GitLab, which allows us to move really fast and get features and products in the hands of customers very quickly, it has an opposite effect on our documentation. So for incident management, we've got all of these fantastic features, and how to use them all together for a single experience is a little bit challenging to find. So we're going to be adding a brand new section to GitLab Docs called Incident Management. I've detailed the structure and then general guidelines on what each section should contain. And I'm happy to also participate in this issue and add content in color or ideas where needed. Any questions on this guy? Awesome. And the last two. So since we're approaching incident management viable maturity, I wanted to make sure that we've added to the usage ping metrics for how people are using all of the features that make up incident management. I created an epic called usage ping updates for incident management. And then Seth helped me break it out into a handful of issues, and these are designed to fill the cracks per se. So the scope of these is pretty well known, and these can go in where we need some work to do while we're waiting for a review or something of that nature. I did want to clarify one point for the usage ping in general for all the features we're looking at. So Prometheus integrations, the alert endpoint, associating Zoom calls with issues, our Slack integration, embedded metrics, so on and so forth. There are two different ways we can measure this. We can measure this on a project basis, or we can measure this on an instance basis. It's important to understand it on both, but for me, it's most important to know it from an instance basis. And that is because an instance can contain tens of however many projects. And I want to understand how many customers are taking advantage of a given feature. And the relationship between instances and customers or paying accounts is usually, not always, but typically one-to-one. Whereas knowing the number of projects where something is being used doesn't give me an understanding of how many customers are using it, unless I'm able to get the customer name attached to that project, which I don't know if that's sanitized or not. Do you guys know? Okay, so actually maybe that's a good question.
The whole concept of usage ping is so that we're not totally tracking user data, so I would assume that we won't have that information.
Ah, that's a good point. So then that's a great So using the project, I'm sorry, using it from an instance perspective, I don't need to know who it is. It's just great to know how many instances are using it, because then that'll tell me how many customers are using it. And then we can try to positively affect that metric. Cool. Right. That is what 12.4 is looking to be. We've got a few unknowns that we're going to inform at Spikes over the next couple of weeks. And we'll continue to check in and revisit every week. Fantastic.